to the Preservation Association Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. He has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books as well as a coinery. Jim has written numerous articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. He serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association Lincoln. Jim's talk today is number 47 of Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
And as usual, today's program is put together by Gordon Schultz, and without him, there would be no program. We're going to start outside the city of Lincoln today, even though we're talking about Lincoln, because we're in the separate city at that time of Bethany, or Bethany Heights, if you prefer. The house we're looking at has been featured on the cover of Nebraska Land magazine and is appropriately, I suppose, one of Lincoln's mansions. We started out, you may remember, a couple of times ago with the cabins of Lincoln, which didn't take very long, and we've gone into the mansions, which is an open-ended topic. We can probably go on for this for years. So the Beatty Mansion, if you will, or sometimes called the Miles House in Bethany Station, Nebraska. James Beatty came to Bethany Heights, Nebraska, by way of Bethany College in West Virginia. He headed in the interim then several colleges throughout the United States, including the Nebraska Normal College at Peru State. When he got to Bethany, he taught math and education at what was first called the Nebraska Christian University, and later, as most of you will be more familiar with it, as Cotner College in 1889. Also in 1889, he purchased a couple of lots directly north of the college and built this house in 1892. He became president of the Nebraska Christian Board of Education, vice president of Cotner University, later the second president of Cotner University. At that point, he was also the field agent for the university, which meant that he was soliciting funds, for a nice word, and he was selling lots within the community, most of which belonged to the university, so they were using it as a source of funding. 1926, Bethany Heights is annexed along with University Place, Nebraska, to Lincoln. The house itself was purchased in 1901 by a man by the name of Samuel Miles. The address went, when it was annexed, it went from 205 East Oskaloosa to 6950 Lexington, and it sits on the northeast corner of that intersection. His son is much more familiar to Lincolnites, although long before us. He graduated from Bethany High School. He then went to Cotner University and went from there to Harvard Law. We'll see a couple of people today that went to Harvard Law. Seems to be a good stepping stone to coming back to Lincoln. Back in Bethany, Lincoln, he became the Lincoln City attorney. Then in 1947, he became the mayor of the city of Lincoln, and he served 2 terms as mayor. The house itself is on the National Register of Historic Places. The other building, which is associated somewhat loosely with him, is in the village of North Bethany, which was part of Bethany. Bethany was in 2 parts divided. What we think of as Bethany, where Bethany School is located, and then North Bethany, a few blocks to the north, where almost nothing is left of it. Part of the lumberyard is now a printing company, but most of the buildings have just either burned or moldered into the dust. But one of those buildings on the west side of the street, if you look up at the top, you'll see, is the Miles block, and that was built by Mr. Miles as well. Back to the city of Lincoln. Kind of an interesting story, which we'll start with before we talk about the house, is the Lincoln Driving Park, which is kind of the general area we're talking about. It was bounded by 19th Street, 23rd Street, Vine Street, and R Street. In 1884, the Lincoln Driving Park was offered to the State Fair of Nebraska for a 5-year trial period. They probably wisely turned it down. Now, a driving park, there were several in the state of Nebraska by this point in time. One was in Nebraska City, one in Omaha, for example, and it was kind of a park, almost always had a large oval in it for driving your carriage around in a semicircle or a circular path on Sundays. Doesn't seem like something which would gather much currency today, but the driving park was that. It later evolved into a little bit more of a horse race track and so forth. But at any rate, the Lincoln Driving Park was in this area. Then in 1887, a man by the name of Imhoff, who we've talked about his house before, he purchased the entire area for $7,500. It was a good investment because 3 years later, in 1890, he sold it for exactly 10 times that amount, $75,000, and he renamed it the Lincoln Driving Park Association, or Addition. A portion of this was then auctioned off by the Woods brothers, who started in Lincoln as auctioneers, and the particular Woods that auctioned it off told his children this is what he foresaw the Woods brothers becoming, not a cattle auctioneer or a land auctioneer, but real estate development. And he said, and this is the area you should be looking at, outside the city of Lincoln towards the east. He was probably right. 1891, another subdivision is started in that general area called Eddy's, E-D-D-Y, which was on a part owned by a man by the name of Ambrose Eddy. He built the house we see here. He built it for two reasons. He built it as an office for his real estate development and also as a promotion for the subdivision. He also built at the same time with his house office, he built a carriage house to the back. The address would have been 435 North 25th Street. 1902, it was sold to a university professor by the name of W.G. Langworth Taylor, who paid $10,000 for the house. I don't have a figure on what it cost originally, but that's obviously several times what it cost him. Mr. Taylor was a graduate of Yale Law. So he came back and became an instructor or a professor at the University of Nebraska. And one of the observers at the University of Nebraska, I don't know whether it was in an official capacity or not, said that he was unsteady in his constitution, and his lectures were sometimes momentarily incoherent. I think I can relate to that. And his social conduct erratic. So he was obviously a character. And he quickly returned to Harvard, so we didn't need to worry about him too much more. 1907 through 1918, the house itself became a sorority, Kappa Gamma. Then in 1920, it became the Alpha Gamma Rho fraternity, so a little ways from the university. 1949, the house was divided into apartments, and in 1983, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places, so still very much visitable if you're interested. Next house I came upon when I was down photographing for a different house we'll be talking about later on, but the Albert Watkins house is 920 D Street. D is in dog, on the north side of D Street. Albert Watkins is the man's name. He was born in England in 1848. He went to the University of Wisconsin Law Department and graduated there in 1872, 1882. He came to the city of Lincoln, and he owned a newspaper called the Lincoln Democrat. 1885, being a friend of President Cleveland, he was appointed Lincoln's postmaster. In 1887, he acquired this lot number 9, block 191, and built what is called sometimes a Queen Anne. I'm not so sure I would call it a Queen Anne, but I have a terrible time with those definitions, so we'll call it what it's called in one of the descriptions, Queen Anne. 1902, we know him better as the co-author of the Morton Watkins Illustrated History of Nebraska. J. Sterling Morton, the ostensible author, but he greatly revised it, and it became the Morton Watkins Histories. He was also at that point the treasurer of the Security Mutual Insurance Company. 1910, His title became the historian for the Nebraska State Historical Society. Interestingly enough, I don't think the Nebraska State Historical Society today has a historian. It's becoming more difficult. 1923, he passed away. The house, this picture is a very recent picture. So this is what you would look at if you went down a neat house, well kept up. A house which I think virtually everybody is familiar with to some extent. This is the Frank Woods house, 2501 Sheridan, also a very recent picture. We know a lot about Mr. Woods, and we've talked about him in great detail before, so we won't cover him that much. He was a resident of Lincoln, founder of Lincoln Telephone and Telegraph, probably his most famous thing. He was noted at that time as the first richest man in Lincoln. He was didn't quite fill that bill, because there were several people before him who were terribly wealthy, but nonetheless, that was his title, if you will. His family then began forming corporations as holding companies. My favorite is the Sahara Coal Company, which did start as a coal company. Sahara Coal Company, last I knew, still owns some property in the city of Lincoln, but I don't know whether that is absolutely the case or not. One of the properties they own is directly, the half a block directly east of the, I shall call it the Sharp Building, because forever it will be the Sharp Building. I think they've renamed it, but I'll hang on to Sharp Building, just as I did the Stewart Building, and just as I did Gateway Shopping Center. Pretty soon it'll come back if it did. But you know what I'm talking about. They became very interested in local real estate. They also owned an aircraft company outside the city of Lincoln in the little village of Havelock, which at one point in time, the aircraft plant was the largest airplane manufacturer in the world. That's easily said, because if you stop and think about it, I think about television manufacturers or sewing machine manufacturers in the United States. I don't think there are any today. And yet at one time, there were hundreds of manufacturers of both sewing machines and television sets within the United States. So at the time they were the largest aircraft producer in the world, there were hundreds of aircraft producers. They were all tiny. So in comparison to today's, there would be no comparison. But at any rate, they owned that at that one time. They also got into a lot of things that people in Lincoln know very little about. For example, redredging the Missouri River and channelizing it was one of their big projects. They also had the Woods Brothers Silo Company. The Woods Brothers were into everything, and at one time, the Woods Brothers were said to have developed over half of the lots in the city of Lincoln, which would also include later the city of Havelock. The house sits on approximately a 3-acre tract of land. The architect was Paul Hyland of Chicago. Jens Jensen was the landscape architect. A very handsome house, 8 bedrooms, a ballroom. It is termed Italian Renaissance Revival, which I can go along with. My favorite part of the house was a Aeolian pipe organ. And you all are familiar with player pianos, where you can put a roll in it and it will play the piano. This is a player organ, an Aeolian player organ, which I'm not sure whether it works again now. It was restored and worked at one time. It was later became the home of Tom Ruza, who now being gone, as I'm sure in another private hands, and I'm not sure whose it is. This is a map which is kind of hard to describe. North is up. Left and right in the middle is O Street, if you will. We are at approximately 70th and O. And you will see the name dead in the middle of Amelia Leavitt. You will also notice that O Street, which enters on the left-hand side of this, goes up to 70th Street and then suddenly takes a kind of a kink. It goes for not even an eighth of a block before it then kinks back to the northeast and becomes a straight line. So at this point in time, O Street was not the longest straight main street in the United States. And in fact, if we looked at it carefully, it probably never was, but we like to call it that. It certainly went all the way from the Missouri River clear out to parallel to Milford in that area. But nonetheless, O Street was not a straight street. And you can see also why it took that little kink right there, because within the elbow is a creek, Dead Man's Run. And it took that kink so that they didn't have to build several bridges over it. They were ultimately able to bridge it once with the bridge for the railroad and the highway. So if we drive out there today, we will find that O Street is indeed straight as a string. But at that time, O Street was not straight. Part of the story which I want to tell today is probably, looking at Mr. Ed, probably fanciful, but it's such a good story, I'll tell it anyway. But I'll warn you ahead of time that Ed tells me, and other people have told me, probably isn't true, but it may have some basis of fact in it. So take it or leave it. I like it. Amelia Leavitt, this is the Leavitt tract. There are a couple of Leavitt tracts. One of them we'll see is purchased later on by the Shrine Club, which becomes Hillcrest Country Club. The Leavitts owned that right in the middle, the section right there. Right to the right of the E.E. Taylor quarter section. My father was associated, and I think I've told you, with the Taylors. They owned that little tiny section of land from 56th to 70th, from A to O, which they developed, and I don't think there's much farming left in there today, but that's another story. The corner of the E.E. Taylor property, which has some dotted lines on it, I have no idea what they meant originally, but that's where the Village Inn is located on 70th and O Streets, or 66th and O Street, excuse me. That's citing it. Bert Leavitt built the house, which technically was later called 600 North 70th Street. Let's see, what is the next picture? That's what I'm not absolutely sure. Yeah, this is the picture of the house, which you may remember. This is a picture of it later in its days with the upper floors boarded up. This is the north elevation of the house, so we're looking pretty much towards the southwest. He built this house, and later he will sell roughly a half a section to the U.S. Veterans Administration for the construction of the Veterans Hospital. The house itself first became part of the property owned by the Veterans Administration, probably used as a caretaker's house loosely. It was used by them at any rate. And at that time, when I was growing up, the Veterans Hospital, which from our house on South Cotner, that was the first thing we could see. It was being developed as literally a community which would be self-sufficient. Had its own fire department, its own police department, water and sewer department. Everything was self-contained. And the properties are going to get divided off a little bit here and a little bit later. We'll see their 9-hole golf course, for example, which was to the south of the hospital, will be given, if that's quite the right word, to the city of Lincoln for use as a high school, junior high school, which we think of as East High School, and the park which went with it. Kind of a tricky little deal, because he gave it to him at the point where the city of Lincoln did not think they needed a high school that far east, but in order to protect the donation which required that a high school be built on it, they sunk a well. So later we're going to have east on his property to the south of the hospital. This house was ultimately abandoned and boarded up by the Veterans Administration about 1980, which means, of course, it's taken over by anybody that wants to sleep there overnight. It becomes pretty well torn up on the inside. It's made of concrete blocks, not stone. If you glance at it, you might think it is stone. Now we come into the area which Ed can give it to you in detail sometime. It's going to be purchased and maybe repurchased and sold rather peculiarly, I'm not sure exactly, but in around 2003, the house will be picked up and physically moved. Here's the part of the story that probably isn't true. I've seen it written up, but that doesn't make it true. We ordinarily think if it was in the Lincoln Journal, it has to be true, right? But at any rate, the story lives on, true or not, that the house is picked up and sold to a man who's going to move it first to the south and then to the east and use it repurposed as a bed and breakfast. The story that I like shows him offering to buy the house and move it from then owner. It becomes a little bit difficult to know who owned it at that time. We have several owners noted, not the VA anymore, it's sold. My part of the story is that it was picked up, and the purchaser at that point, who's going to move it as a B&B, says he's not sure he can move the house. When you pick up something that big, made of concrete, lots of movement. So he said he would give them a minor amount of money. I can't remember, something like $100. We'll pick the house up and move it south on 70th Street to A Street. When we turn on A Street to head east, if the house is still intact, it proves that I can move it, and I will pay the balance of what I owe you for it. And the amount of the transaction varies. Oftentimes it's $100,000, and I don't know what the true amount was, but it got there. They turned the corner, and he paid the balance. He owned the house, and it was moved, and is now a B&B a couple of miles to the east and a little bit south of Lincoln. Today, the house faces, I think it faces north, but at any rate, it's been turned on its axis a little bit if you go out that way. So a story and a house, some of which may be true and maybe not, but kind of an interesting house. And a lot of you remember it. But the thing that makes it interesting is we remember that house, and people talked about it being located on the southeast corner of 70th and O. But it wasn't. Yes, it was. But it wasn't. Because remember, O Street was not a straight line. So it was somewhat, not a quarter of a block, but somewhat south of O Street. And yet, it was on O Street, because O Street kind of moved around a little bit. Take the story as you will. We'll move on. The Charles Gear House, we see it here, moved. Charles Gear himself came to Table Rock, Nebraska first in 1865, so it's during territoryhood before statehood. He is an attorney, and he becomes a county attorney in Pawnee City. Then in 1867, that key date when Nebraska becomes a state, he becomes the private secretary to David Butler, who was the first governor. A good gig for a while. In 1867, he will start something called the Nebraska Commonwealth, which is a newspaper which will be a Lincoln newspaper, but it will be printed not in Lincoln, but will start printed in Nebraska City, its first issue. Printed in Nebraska City, but intended for circulation in Lincoln, probably because there really wasn't any place to have it, the printing facilities in Lincoln at that time. And certainly the printing press was located in Nebraska City. Charles Gear himself was well known at that time for lobbying for all of the state institutions to be in the city of Lincoln. This would be the university, the penitentiary, the insane asylum, and so forth. Kind of unusual, because in most states we'll find those things scattered around the state. But Gear's theory was, and one of the things he promoted, was the fact that there was nothing in Lincoln. And in order to have the capital city work, we'd need all those institutions in one place to get it a good start. I think he was right for the time, and so we had all of those things start in Lincoln. In 1869, the name of the newspaper becomes the Nebraska State Journal. It is now printed in Lincoln. It is printed on type, which was worn out in Nebraska City and given to him free of charge, on a printing press, which was worn out, and he brought it to the Lincoln, probably located in the southwest corner of 9th and O Street. In that area, there was a fairly large building. Today, there is a 2-story parking garage. It probably was within that block. In 1869, he became the head of the Lincoln Board of Trustees. And the president of the Lincoln Board of Trustees would be, for all intents and purposes, the mayor of the city of Lincoln. The title didn't exist at that point in time. He later becomes the Lancaster County Attorney. And at that point, he begins to argue also for having, was a $50,000 bond issue which passed in Lincoln, and he lobbied to have that money used to build a central high school, not to be broken up and to build several smaller schools. He thought we should have one major central high school. It was not to be located in the block the state had designated as the high school block, but in the block, which later we think of as Pershing Municipal Auditorium's block. So that's where the first high school was built, and he won that idea. 1890, the house, we see it, was designed by William Tyler. or excuse me, was he the contractor? William Tyler built a house on the center of 3 lots, not here, but on land which he had purchased in 1867 from the state of Nebraska at the state auction sale, which was used in 1867 to get funds to build the city of Lincoln and to operate the state government. He paid $200 for the 3 lots. The carriage house sat on the westernmost of the 3 lots. The house itself sat in the center lot. Again, we'll call it the southwest corner of 9th and D Streets. He actually owned, ultimately, the whole half of block 205. About 1925, roughly, 3 daughters, sisters, wanted the house. They were given the house by Mr. Gear. It was to be their house as long as they lived in it. They didn't want to live at 9th and D, but they wanted to live in the house. So the answer was simple. They just got a huge chainsaw and cut that sucker in half. And they then picked up the house and moved it to the southwest corner of 24th and Van Dorn. A truckload of crazy glue and the house was put back together again, and that's where it sits here. We can see some vestiges of the original house. On the north elevation, you can see there where there's a little L'Oreal window. This is where there was a porte-cochere originally, and a wagon or a carriage would have pulled up there, long since gone and changed. Also, I think when Ariel Bybee, or maybe before her, an elevator was put into the house, which my understanding is the elevator no longer works, but at least it's still in there. So the house is picked up and moved. But there is a little bit left down there on D Street, and that is the carriage house. It's still there. This is looking towards the southwest, and it would have been southwest of the house when it sat down there. I think the Martins wrote a history of that one time. I could be wrong. Well, this is an interesting area, not so far from where I live. This is the Hardy house. Not quite there yet. Harvey Wesley Hardy was the man. He moved first to Aurora, Nebraska in 1868, so Nebraska was 1 year old at that point in time, and there in Aurora he operated a furniture store. Quickly, 2 years later, in 1870, he moved to the city of Lincoln and opened a store at 800 O Street. He was a friend of William Jennings Bryan and a Democrat. 1876, he was head of the Board of Education. 1877, a year later, he was elected mayor of the city of Lincoln. And as mayor, he is the one that saw to it that $300 of city funds was given to the library. And at that point, the Lincoln Library is called the Lincoln City Library. Although it is still, you had to be a member to check out a book, you could go in and read a book. And that's the first funding that came from the city. So the city library, which had been 2 private libraries, the ladies' reading room and the young men's reading room, were joined together, and he gave the money which created the city library, so to speak. When he was running for his second term as mayor, his opposition, rather subtly, bought a coffin and sat it on his front doorstep, saying, "This could happen to you," or something like that. Subtle, right? He was very much a prohibition candidate, and the people who sat the coffin there very much weren't prohibition candidates. So what did Mr. Hardy do? He took the coffin and he sold it to his partner. His partner was a mortician, and of course at that time in small communities, particularly in the Midwest, the furniture store was also the undertaker. So Mr. Pitcher bought it and took the $13 which he paid for the coffin and gave it to the WCTU. Take that. And of course he was elected. He also, interestingly, when he finished his second term, left the city of Lincoln with a $5,000 surplus. How about that? We don't see that very much anymore. 1887, Hardy and Pitcher, again the furniture mortician combination, are located in what I think of as the Gold's parking lot block. In other words, directly south of Gold's. It's now has a large residential building in it. Son William Hardy graduates from Lincoln High School, and then in 1918, 1919, He moves to this house and builds it, 615 West 7th Avenue in the village of College View. Today, we would call it 4201 Calvert Place. 10 acres of land on the south side of Calvert. The house is still there. A lot of the rest of the property has been divided into smaller lots, and it was at this time that Hardy Furniture moved over to 1314 O Street, where many of us remember Hardy Furniture being located. In the 1930s, William's son Phil moves into Calvert Place and marries the sister of J.C. Seacrest. So, and you can see the city of Lincoln, it becomes intermarried at a certain level, which happens in every city. 1950, Phil will move to the old Stewart Mansion at 1040 South Cotner Boulevard, which is still there as well. 1955, we see Calvert Place divided up. The main house still sits right on the Calvert side and is the first house you see on the west side. 1973, Hardy Furniture closed. On the very day the furniture store was 101 years old. And I mentioned to the guy who was the manager of their store, was this accidental or did it just happen? And he had no idea that the store was on that very day 101 years old, so it did just happen. Interesting place to walk. Walk over there and you can walk around within this area, see the house and the others, all much later, but all very nice houses. This is the east elevation, so we're looking directly west. Nice house. The A.S. or Aaron Sheldon Raymond House. Mr. Raymond came to Lincoln in 1872 as a wholesale grocer. He was from Waverly, Iowa. In 1882, the firm became the Raymond Brothers when his brother Isaac joined the firm. And then in 1897, Aaron left and started Lincoln Drug Company. By 1900, they were one of the largest wholesale grocers in the Midwest. In 1951, that corporation was liquidated. In 1885, he built this house, which is sometimes called 4 stories, but I don't quite, they have to count the basement to make it 4 stories, which seems unusual. On the southwest corner of, no, the grocery built at, I'm sorry, in 1885, on the southwest corner of 8th and O. The house itself was not there. It was on the northwest corner of 17th and R Streets, so over kind of the corner of the university at that point in time. Built 1880 on the north side of R Street. It was noted in the city directory as the second house east of Grand Avenue, and we'll be talking about Grand Avenue in a little bit. He occupied the house in 1881, and by 1935, it's completely gone. Nothing is left of it, and if you were to go to that area today, you would find it called University Terrace. No record of, no remnant of it at all. Here, I think we will pause for about 30 seconds, and we will convert to the next tray. Easily done, if you know what you're doing, and I don't. Smoke them if you got them. Yep, that's it.
Okay.
Now this house, that's more like it. Had me there for a minute. This house is familiar to, I think, probably all of you. Not in this particular state, but we'll be talking about that. William Jennings Bryan arrived in the city of Lincoln in approximately 1887. He officed and lived, if you will, if you can say it that way, in the Burr Block, which was on the northeast corner of 12th and O Street. Sort of still exists, sort of doesn't still exist. Security Mutual, that's it. We could almost do a program on the reconstruction of that building completely as a 1-hour segment. I'll employ Bob to take over. Rebuilding that building was absolutely bizarre. Let's put it that way. At any rate, supposedly Mr. Bryan lived in the Burr Block and had his office in the Burr Block, living there and cooking over a gas ring. So he was subsisting in his office. At that point in time, same year roughly, he will buy a lot at 1625 D Street, which is extant. And that following year, he brought wife Mary into the city of Lincoln, and they lived in that house. Then in 1890, he purchased, first of all, 5 acres of land near Normal, Nebraska. He paid $250 an acre, which he at the time said was considerably more than it was worth, but he said $100 of that was paid for the scenery. The rest of it was for the land. 1897, he will buy an additional 30 acres of land just a bit northeast of the original amount, and there he set up a farm. In 1900, Mary, Mrs. Bryan, and Artemus Roberts, neighbor, an architect, will set up the plans and develop Fairview, which we see under construction here. In 1901, he will move from D Street into the brick barn, which he had built for the farm, which is to the north and a bit east, I think is correct, of this house. At least it's to the north of it. In 1902, he will actually move into, or October 1 of 1902, he will actually move into the house. We're looking here at the west elevation of the house, and you can see now the house as we know it today, sort of, but you can see how the construction went. It cost variously either $17,000 or $20,000. At any rate, it was a bargain, called Queen Anne, and I guess I can see Queen Anne a little bit more in this house. 3 stories tall, 25 rooms, a tower, which had a green slate roof, heated by hot water, and 6 fireplaces. It had a sunlight basement, which is clearly visible there, which had 2 bedrooms in it. The 3rd floor also had 6 bedrooms. The west elevation here, which had 2 stone called Korean lions. One of them had its mouth open, which Bryan called radicalism. The other had its mouth closed, which he called conservatism. Let's see, what do we got? Yeah, okay, 1903. Not sure whether this is the 4th of July, 1903. It's labeled 2 different things on the back of the picture I have. But if it is the 4th of July, it may be him receiving the nomination for presidency. That's also noted on the back of the same picture, so I don't know. But at that point in time, it was noticed that he said, or at least someone quoted him as saying, Bryanism would be known worldwide from this point forward. And Fairview itself became, quote, a mecca for democratic leaders, and to quote President Woodrow Wilson, for example, spent the night here. 1906, he will gift 10 acres of land to Antelope Park to the west. I don't think this is part of his original purchases, his 2 purchases. He owned several tracts of land through the years, and I don't know how that tract came from. In 1908, we know that he did accept the 3rd nomination for president on the west steps of the house. Whether the picture is of one or the other, I don't know. In 1917, he will move and retire to Florida, primarily because of Mary's health. 1921, he offered the house to his church, which people are amazed to learn was the Presbyterian Church. He offered it to the Presbyterians to make a Lincoln hospital. The Presbyterians cordially declined. They said they had a hospital in Omaha, which is all they could afford to keep up, and they declined the gift. His law partner for a time in Lincoln was a man named A.R. Talbot, who was a strong Methodist and was also in charge of acquiring property for a Methodist hospital in Lincoln. He'd in fact bought some lots already on Randolph Street, but Mr. Talbot learned the Presbyterians had turned him down. He went to Bryan and convinced him to give the land instead to the Methodist Church, Mary's Church. He's confused as being a Methodist additionally because he used to preach at the Normal Methodist Church, but still was a Presbyterian. By the way, the Methodist Church in Normal, Nebraska was picked up and moved to Milford, where it still stands. And I think Lowell, I think you gave me some pictures of that building. It's still there, that Methodist Church. Right, moved from Lincoln to Milford. Supposedly, and I've not been able to confirm this, but the couch which he slept on in the Burr block is in this house. But they have so changed the house through the years. It was never used as a hospital. It had many, many uses as a function of the hospital, nurses' dormitory, and so forth, and offices. They used to have the building and the house open for tours. My understanding is this year, being an anniversary, that you can get tours of the house, but it's not open on a regular basis. So if you're thinking of tour it, don't go over, call first and find out how that works. The D Street house is extant. They've torn off the veranda and the porch roof, from which Mr. Bryan was said to love to stand up there and give speeches from the roof of the porch. The parts of the house which may still be there, that were there not so very long ago, was above the fireplace there were two 8-inch tiles which featured the faces of his children. Whether those are extant or not, I do not know. We'll assume they are. Next house is the Granger house. 1881, the brothers Harry and Joseph Granger immigrated from England. They both lived at 1439 S Street at that time. 1886, they opened a fruit market at 917 Q Street. In 1887, as commission agents, they called themselves, 1016 P Street. They were wholesale and fruit produce wholesalers at that point in time. Then in 1902, they purchased the Tremont Hotel, which is one of the hotels which was built near the Burlington Station on the southwest corner of 8th and P Streets. They moved their business, their wholesale business, into the Tremont Hotel at a point where they had between 40 and 50 employees and 11 salesmen on the road. So if we look at the buildings down in the Haymarket, we can see that what it's turning into is a wholesale fruit, vegetable, coffee, all sorts of wholesale groceries. Lots of people. 1907, the Tremont's Hotel's stable next door is acquired. 1912, they will buy the next building or site towards the south, or on O Street, which is the site of the old Metropolitan Hotel. Then in 1936, the building which had been the livery stable directly south of the Tremont Hotel building explodes, killing 4 people. And it was a explosion which was because nitrous oxide is a gas which they had one room which they could seal, and they put bananas in that room. And if you have the right combination of oxygen and nitrous oxide, it is not explosive. And you can see where this is going. And they used that to ripen bananas. But not only did it ripen bananas, but it also had the secondary feature of killing tarantulas. And my wife's grandfather, who had a grocery store in Fairbury, said that literally every stand of bananas, which is so tall, literally every one of them had a tarantula in it. So killing the tarantulas was a good idea. And her grandfather's basement was a fruit jar with one of them tarantulas in it. And her grandfather loved to send one of the grandchildren down to the basement to get a can of peaches, because he kept the mason jar with the tarantula in it right in front of the peaches. So I'm delighted in that. But at any rate, they didn't have the mixture quite right, and that blew up. I think it's interesting that during the Depression, Harry Granger Jr. had an idea, and he conceived something which is kind of no longer in existence. He came up with the idea of food stamps. Harry Granger Jr. 1965, Granger's moved out to the industrial tract, and it was ultimately sold to Fleming Foods. 1970, B Street was built by Joseph Granger in 1910. And interestingly, 2105 B Street became Harry Granger's house. Mr. Billingsley. L.W. Billingsley moved to Lincoln in 1874 when the population was around 7,000. In 1876, he was elected to the city council, and at that point he lived at 1024 J Street. 1877, 1 year later, he purchased 2 lots on the northwest corner of 10th and H Street, which would be 944 H Street, and he built this little bungalow. 1887, I'll get it out. He built the 3-story house. And he also built the Montgomery block he built next to the Montgomery block, which became the Billingsley-Montgomery block. Excuse me, I'm sort of mingling my story here. That double building, read as one building, built in 2 different sections by Mr. Billingsley and Mr. Montgomery. That was at 200 South 11th Street, which would put it directly to the north of St. Paul Methodist Church's extension, if that's easily thought of. At any rate, in 1970, that building, the Billingsley-Montgomery building, was torn down. 1970 became Lincoln Federal Savings and Loan. Back to Mr. Billingsley. In 1885, he was elected to the city council. At that point in time, they're just in time for the city of Lincoln to be redefined as a city of the first class. Population has reached a point. Almost all of the city appointees, their terms expired with that, but one man held over. He was the police judge, Albert Parsons. So he was one of the people who carried forth. The others had to all be reappointed or reelected or re-somethinged. Parsons, however, got himself in trouble because he was accepting payouts. He was diverting fines from what should have been the school fund into his pocket, and the city council summarily fired him. He said, "You can't fire me." This begins to sound a little bit familiar. "You can't fire me." So he will file a suit in federal court saying that they can't fire him. The city council and the mayor ignore the federal suit. Shouldn't do that. And they will end up in jail in Omaha. The city council and the mayor, the city of Lincoln. It turns out to be pretty much a tempest in a teapot. They're treated royally. They're living in the sheriff's quarters and do very well. They send their attorney back to Washington, D.C., appears before the U.S. Supreme Court, and the city wins that case, becomes the principle of home rule, which cities now all over the United States rely on, saying, yes, they can fire people. The house itself becomes a fraternity, the Kappa Sigma, in about 1910, then it goes back to being a single-family house. 1925, it's divided into apartments, and in 1965, it's torn down and becomes the southeast corner of the property we're standing on, or the county city building. So long gone. Mr. Billingsley, his business was as an attorney. He was a local attorney for the Chicago, Ohio, and the Pacific Railroad. Cute little house, one of my favorites, and the Guy Brown house. Mr. Brown was born in New York in 1846. 1862, he was in the Union Army, and when he left, he had the title of honorary major. What that means, I don't have the slightest idea. An honorary major. 1867, he moves to Nebraska City, where he becomes the clerk of the Otoe County Court. He then becomes the clerk for the Nebraska Supreme Court. 1871, in Lincoln, he becomes the state librarian in the Capitol building. He is also the clerk during the Butler impeachment proceedings. He lived at first on J Street, on the north side of J between 25th and 26th. Then in 1874, he bought 2 lots on 27th Street for $3,500. He moved into 219 South 27th, which he called nearly a mile east of the city of Lincoln, kind of out there by itself. 1881, he's on the Lincoln Board of Education. 1889, he will move into the much larger 12-room, again, Queen Anne house at 255 South 27th. And again, I don't quite understand the definition of Queen Anne, but nonetheless. 1890, he passed away. His wife moves to the son's house. In the 1930s, that brick porch is added, and the house is turned into a duplex. In 1966, it is placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And it certainly doesn't seem like 1966 is that far away, because I can remember that rather clearly. I don't have a good picture of the next house because it was so surrounded by trees that all you can see in the pictures I've got are the trees. So we'll carry on with the McKelvey house by looking at his carriage house, which stood for many, many years after the house was torn down. Beginning in territorial days, the governor of the territory, which is appointed by the president, received $2,500, which was a housing allowance and salary. $2,500, however, was not per year. It was for his 4-year term. So not a very much amount of money, the salary and his housing allowance. Then in 1867, with statehood, his housing alone, he was given $1,000. He still had to do housing, so he had to either stay in a hotel or rent a house or build one himself. 1873, the legislature of the state of Nebraska considered building a mansion. They talked about it, but the bill was just presented, quietly died. 1875, they increased the governor's salary to $2,500 now per year, but had no provision for residence. And at that time, they were considering buying a 2-acre site for a suitable governor's mansion, end of quote. That also died. Nothing happened. 1885, the governor will receive a $2,000 annual housing allowance. 1893, Governor Lorenzo Krantz will turn down housing allowance. 1899, D.E. Thompson, whose house will become the governor's mansion, was acquired for $21,385. And at that point in time, they also allowed $3,000 per year for upkeep of the house. That is the one that's directly across from the Capitol to the south. 1907, the governor is George Sheldon, and he was afraid that the governor's mansion was extra income to him. So he asked the state Supreme Court to sue him for $100 because he wants this question answered. The Supreme Court said that free room at the mansion was not compensation. So he was in the clear. 1919, enter Governor Sam McKelvey, the boy governor. He asked the question, did he have to live in the mansion? He said, I own a better house on the northeast corner of 26th and N Streets. Supreme Court said the governor did not have to live in the mansion. And some governors, I don't think, hardly set foot in the mansion since then. The house was raised considerably after that, but the carriage house lived on. We're standing on N Street looking up towards the north, and I don't know exactly when I took this picture, but if you would go down to that site today and take a picture, you would find nothing because the house is gone. The grade has been lowered considerably down to N Street, and it's nothing but a parking lot for the building there. Should I continue with another one, do you think, Elaine? How are we? Go ahead.
We call for questions.
Okay, we'll open it for questions, and we will pick it up here next time, Gordon. We'll have enough for another one. Are there any questions? We have time for, yes.
And the Woods House on Sheridan, the one with the organ,
Yeah.
was it in the ballroom? Where was the organ located?
Well, the organ, and Ed may be able to help me a little bit more with this. As I recall, the organ was on the organ console was down in the living room on the first floor, not in the ballroom. And the mechanics were up on the balcony on the north side. Is that how you remember it, Ed?
The pumps and air handling equipment was in the basement, or is in the basement.
Okay.
The pipes are largely the staircase.
Oh, wow.
So it's really fully integrated into the house.
One of my besties used to babysit kids there when the Rosenbergs lived there, and I asked her if she remembered the organ, and she didn't remember, but maybe she thought it was a piano or something.
Well, I don't know. As I remember, the console was on the first floor.
Okay.
And if you went in the front door on the north side, you could almost walk straight ahead, almost to it. That's a simplification, but. And at that time, it had been restored, and they could play it. But my understanding is that Tom Hruza, that it was, again, no longer playable, but I don't have any further information on it. And I don't know who owns the house now.
I think Joan is still in residence. Widow Joan is still
There, I
there.
believe. Yeah, as far as I know, but
Thank you.
certainly, you know, probably wouldn't take it out. None question.
I gotta try and be closer.
I think we've answered every single question there is. Okay. And if you want any corrections, Ed will be glad to correct. I have a great deal of liberty I take with facts. I try to stay mostly with facts.